2025 Georgia Point Source Emissions Inventory Training. My name is Ruben Gihan Felix. I am the manager of the Emissions Control and Strategies Unit. We're the unit pretty much tasked with collecting everyone's emissions reports for the year for the state of Georgia. And today you'll be hearing from myself. You'll be hearing from Emily Phillips, Tess Mosley, and also Alma Mikey, who all work in the ECSU unit and also help with point source emissions inventory work. And yeah, just to kind of give an outline of what you all will be hearing about today. So we'll give a little bit of regulatory background context, pretty much talk about the rules which mandate us to collect emissions. We'll get into the Combined Air Emissions Reporting System, or CARES, which you all use to report your emissions. We'll follow that up with some HAPS guidance updates that we have for everyone. And then we'll get into the submittal walkthrough process, followed by Georgia Quality Assurance. And we'll kind of finish up with some helpful tips, resources, and next steps. So just to begin, to give, again, a little bit more context for the regulations that kind of govern us to, again, collect emissions reports from everyone. There are two kind of main rules. Next slide. So the kind of the rule that mandates states to collect air emissions is actually the first one here listed. It's 40 CFR Part 51 Subpart A. This is known as AERR, or the Air Emissions Reporting Requirements. In this rule is where the federal government has mandated states to collect emissions inventories for certain criteria pollutants and HAPs. So the last time this rule was updated was actually 2015. However, there were proposed updates that were proposed in late 2023. If you were here with us last year, we probably talked a little bit more in depth about those. However, there have not been any updates to those proposed rules. So that's kind of why we're not getting too much into them now. We don't really have any sort of insight as to how that rule will play out, or those rule updates will play out. But if there is an update, we'll definitely be sure to pass that information along to the facilities in Georgia. And then there's also a state rule. Oh, previous slide. Yeah. There's also a state rule that sort of also gives the director of EPD the ability to essentially request certain information from facilities. That's that rule, Georgia Rule 391-3-1-.026B1. So if you're ever curious, that's sort of the state version of AERR, if you will. So that kind of gives a blanket authority for the director. Something to note for this year, we have pushed back or moved up our deadline for facilities to report data to the original deadline, which is May 31st. So this will be May 31st, 2026 this year. Please note that no extensions will be provided after June 15th. And also CARES will be opening January 5th, 2026 this year. So next slide. So as mentioned, if you look at the right here on this slide, these are the thresholds that are found in AERR for pretty much if you're emitting above these thresholds, your facility is required to report emissions for that operating year. There are some exceptions. So if you're a permitted but not constructed facility, you don't have to report. Facilities with federally enforceable permit limits, such as synthetic miners, that's an exception as well. And facilities which were shut down during the entire calendar year aren't required to report. So please note, this year, 2025, is an annual year. There are two different types of years listed in the AERR, an annual year and a triennial year. And the differences being the triennial year thresholds are much lower, so a lot more facilities get looped into that reporting year. The last time we had that was 2023. Again, 2025 is an annual year, so the thresholds associated are a bit higher. Um, and then also something important to note, thresholds are all PTE based except for lead. Next slide. So next we'll get into what CARES is. So CARES is known as the Combined Air Emissions Reporting System. This is a federally developed application made by EPA that allows industry to essentially report their emissions to state, local, or tribal authorities. This lets us meet the requirements listed in AERR. And there's also some kind of helpful tools baked into CARES. We'll get into that a little bit later. But it's been developed to essentially try to make it as easy as possible for a facility to report their yearly emissions. Please note, in CARES, you are also able to voluntarily report HAPs, which Georgia is a state that we do encourage facilities to report their HAPs whenever possible. However, it's not mandated. It's purely voluntarily reported at this point in time. We'll get a little bit more into that, into the HAPs guidance updates. But yeah, again, we definitely encourage any facility to report their HAPs when possible. Please note that TRI data must still be completed and certified in TRI ME web, and also that SLTs or state and local tribal authorities, in order to meet specific air emissions reporting requirements. I think there is sort of like a crosswalk between CARES and the toxics release inventory. So hopefully there's some compatibility that facilities can sort of utilize in that crosswalk. So next slide. Next, I'll get into the CARES user roles. So within CARES, there are two different types of roles. There is what we call a preparer, and there is a certifier. So the differences between the two roles being that a facility can have multiple preparers. A preparer can create the initial report. However, that preparer role cannot certify the report. For a certifier role, a facility is only allowed one certifier per facility, and that certifier is able to create the initial report and also certify that report. So yeah, those are the differences between the two roles within CARES. Next slide. Next, I'm going to hand it over to Emily Phillips, who will get into the HAPS guidance updates.
All right, thank you, Ruben. So as Ruben had mentioned before, Georgia encourages voluntary HAP reporting, but it is not mandatory. So for 2025, our HAP pilot program, as we call it, encouraging voluntary reporting. We'll ask for feedback on that reporting process and the timeline, like how long it took you to fill out that HAPS, whether it's from previous years that you've reported or if you're filling it in new. And a benefit of completing that in CARES is that it is available for import into the TRI ME web app as soon as a facility has certified that in CARES. So we don't need to accept your numbers before it's available in the TRI ME web app, and it just avoids kind of duplicate work if you are voluntarily reporting HAPs. Currently, there is no additional information on the updated AERR that would require voluntary HAPs reporting at this time. So if you do choose to report HAPs voluntarily in CARES, they're submitted essentially exactly like HAPs. CAPs, one important note is that HAPs should still include their corresponding CAP, be included in their corresponding CAP. So for example, if a HAP is also VOC, it should be included in that VOC CAP reporting because that represents total CAP. This isn't double counting because CAPs and HAPs are always kept separate in terms of data, and they're not summed into that total VOC automatic or in any sort of automated way. Uh, and uh, there one thing to note is that HAPs are not kept separate from each other. So there have been, I noticed there's a few chemicals that overlap, such as chromium and hexavalent chromium. They have issues. So if you are choosing to voluntarily report making sure that if you're reporting hexavalent chromium, not to also report chromium. So now we'll walk you through the process of the 2025 Georgia Point Source Inventory. This process has three main components. The first is reporters will need to update their facility and contact information in Gecko. Next, they will determine whether they are uh, qualify for opt-in or opt-out. And finally, they will submit their emissions inventory report or their opt-out determination, both in CARES. So the first step is to go into Gecko to update your facility information. There's a link on this screen for if you need to register for an account if you've never accessed Gecko before. Returning users with emissions inventory access will have the facility names listed and that emissions inventory box checked. You will check on the facility, or you will click on the facility name to access the emissions inventory form. And for new users, you will need to request access to your facility using that button at the bottom. So this screen is where reporters request access to their facility. Make sure to check that emissions inventory box and review the admin users listed. If the admin users are unavailable for whatever reason, or you need any assistance regarding that access from Georgia EPD, please check that box that corresponds to that statement I just said. If the admin users are available, an email will be sent to them to approve. If not, we'll go through the approval process with you, and Gecko will show a preview of this email when you send the request. So once you click on the facility name, once you have access in Gecko, you'll arrive at the home page. The user access tab allows facility admins to manage user access, and the communications preference tab can be changed here, but we'll also point it out. It's available in the emissions inventory form as part of our kind of checklist. So the emissions inventory link is where you can find access to the 2025 emissions inventory application. So this is what the Gecko form looks like at the top. It's formatted to hopefully be streamlined, so and kind of step by step. So the first step, once you're in the emissions inventory application, is to review the facility info. If there's any information that is incorrect, please let us know by emailing us at the email listed in the form.emissions.inventory email. And so things to note is making sure that the NAICS code listed here is what is in CARES. And also note that your coordinates are correct and that they are in that correct datum, the WGS84. That's the datum that we use for our storage, and that's the one that Google Maps uses for reference. So next, you'll want to update your contact information, which includes your main emissions inventory contact and then later all the CARES user roles. The instructions here have you update the main emissions inventory contact first through that link. And that link will open the communications preferences tab. You will select the emissions inventory link on the left side and have access to the input fields. And so once you save the contact information, you can close out of this screen. To update the CARES users, you may need to, you'll need to add or modify users here. The contact information is important to fill out in Gecko first because this is how we check that requests in CARES are legitimate. So if it doesn't match, if the Gecko table does not match CARES access request, it could lead to delays in gaining access in CARES. Some things you can, to remember is you can change your users anytime throughout the year. You're not locked into it at the beginning of the year. You can add preparers or change or certify as needed. And the same person can be a preparer or certifier. So if, and that can kind of streamline this process. You don't have to send it to a certifier to then certify that report after it's been completed. So this year, similar to last year, we'll send out emails to facilities at the beginning of the year to indicate whether we expect a facility qualifies to opt in or needs to report. In the email, if it's an opt out, we'll indicate the potential to emit that we have in our Georgia EPD records. So if the facility accepts those numbers and they're accurate, they can use a PDF of that email as confirmation. But if the facility, for whatever reason, disagrees with the potential to emit that we have on record, they can submit a revised opt-out form, which can be downloaded in this screen by that link. And the screen also provides instructions for those who are new to CDX or CARES users, and you can use that link to open CARES CDX. This year, CARES will launch on January 5th for the 2025 emissions inventory year. So this is an example of what the opt-out form looks like. It's essentially the same as last year, with the same annual thresholds. If your facility must complete an opt-out form, you'll need to fill out the correct potential to emit emissions and whether that PTE comes from a permit or an application. The column to the right indicate what justification is needed for the facility response based on where that PTE comes from. And you'll put that permit condition, if it's a permit limit, application number, if it's an application, or any additional information in that facility response box. So once you're in CARES, you'll select your facility and then select the Create New Report button. This will prompt several questions to determine your facility's opt-in status officially. So these are the two questions that CARES asks. So the first one is if your facility was operating for the emissions inventory year. If your facility was not operating, then all that's required is to certify. No additional information is needed. But if your facility was operating, you'll be asked a second question about whether your facility falls above or below those emissions inventory thresholds. So if your facility is above those thresholds, you'll need to fill out emissions inventory report. But if they're not, just providing the opt-out justification, whether it's a copy of that email or a revised opt-out form, and then certify. So this is what the opt-out form looks like. It's essentially a blank version of the emissions inventory report. And you'll need to attach your potential to emit documentation and then certify. If you are needing to complete an emissions inventory report for the year, there's essentially 3 different ways that you can report. And you can use a combination of these how you want. So there's the bulk upload template that allows for offline work and can kind of copy and paste things more easily, especially in mass. The bulk entry allows for updates of throughputs and individual emissions, all kind of in one page in CARES. And then the user interface is a more detailed information and automatically creates connections between all the units, processes, and controls that would manually need to be done in the bulk upload template. So this is what the bulk upload template looks like. It's handled entirely in an Excel workbook. The report is laid out in different interconnected tabs. And this version is good for large standard updates to a report, but we don't recommend it for complex changes for a facility. And then the data bulk entry is kind of a streamlined option within the CARES interface. It only allows for updates to throughputs and individual pollutant emissions. So if there's a update to any operating hours or anything like that, that can't be handled here. The greater user interface takes more time to navigate, but we do recommend it for complex updates because it reduces errors if you're adding like a unit and then it automatically kind of connects it to any processes you add and creating those connections between like release points and controls. It can be a little bit tricky, especially in the bulk upload template. So once your report is finished, quality checks must be run before a report can be certified. Errors are critical issues that must be addressed before submitting. You won't be allowed to click that certify button with errors, but warnings are just additional notes that may reveal issues they may not, such as if you're reporting a large change in emissions, that could be correct. It also could indicate that you've incorrectly added too high of a number. So those kinds of things, just review those warnings and make sure that they don't reveal any actual issues. So now I'll send it over to Tess to go over our QA process.
Thank you, Emily. So before reviewing the Georgia QA process, we wanted to touch briefly on some confidential business information related rules. We've included a more detailed overview of what is considered CBI on this slide, and on the next slide, we have what is not considered CBI. These are just for you to refer back to if needed once this is sent out. But as a general summary, if a facility has information that they believe qualifies for CBI, they may submit an affidavit declaring what specific information is considered trade secrets. Information that is eligible for protection includes data, formulas, programs, devices, and more that derives actual or potential economic value from not being generally known and is the subject of reasonable efforts to maintain secrecy. Information that is necessary to identify the type, amount, frequency, stack parameters, or other characteristics of pollutants emitted cannot be considered protected. If there is CBI involved, facilities will submit a protected and redacted version of applicable documents. Any information that does not qualify as CBI will still be considered public records and may be released under a GOR request. So now to get into some of the quality assurance checks, this is an example of our QA template. We use the reports downloaded from CARES and the list of QA warnings to check that report along with Georgia EPD information, such as permits, for any inconsistencies or other issues that would prevent us from sending the report to EPA. Some of the things that we check, CARES conducts automatic QA checks that the user can address when completing the emissions inventory. However, we also do our own QA checks that have not been implemented in CARES or are Georgia specific. Some things include the opt-out status. So for facilities who are opting out, we will check what the facility has provided against our records to make sure everyone is on the same page. We check that temporarily or permanently shut down facilities are opting out for the correct year. So for example, if a facility operated part of 2025 but temporarily shut down for the rest of the year, then the facility is still considered operating in 2025. If your facility is no longer a Title V facility starting at some point in 2024, then you should not have received an email. If you have, please reach out to us and we will address the issue. We also check that all co-located facilities to ensure that they are reporting based on collective PTE totals. This affects co-located facilities whose PTEs add up together to exceed thresholds. If this is the case, both facilities will need to report. We'll also check controls and emissions units. So for controlled devices, we check what facilities list against previous CARES entries and applicable permits. Additionally, we'll check that controlled pollutants are listed with both the control device and control path. For the emissions data, we'll check SEC code specificity. So please refrain from using general source classification codes. In some cases, it's justifiable, but we will review all general SECs used to determine if there's a more specific code to represent the emissions process. Any zero throughput and emissions units should be marked as temporarily shut down or permanently shut down if this is the situation. There is an exception, which we'll mention later, to the zero throughput emissions situation. We'll also check changes in throughput or a change in emissions factor to determine if there are any significant facility-wide changes in CAP and HAP totals. We'll look for facility provided explanations, but if we cannot reach a conclusion through these means, we'll reach out to you. For CAPs, any facility-wide emissions changes greater than 20% will trigger a check, and for HAPs, it's anything greater than 10%. And then CARES has no decimal limits, but 6 decimal points are preferred. Please do not round to whole numbers when manually entering emissions. These are screenshots from one of our QA spreadsheets where we check for emissions correctness and reproducibility. Our spreadsheet has built-in formulas that take into consideration the provided inputs, but if you can't calculate, then we will manually review these entries. When a material is a fuel, please enter the fuel material first in the CARES user interface, then use the copy fuel data to the throughput data fields, which duplicates the entry to the throughput fields. If you're in the bulk upload template, ensure that you type the same information for both the throughput and fuel value fields. Additionally, we check for heat content when a fuel is the process throughput. If you don't have one, please use the default heat content ratio for CARES PDF found on the EPA CARES webpage. Some things to note is emission factors, throughput values, operating hours, and any other information used to calculate emissions should be included in CARES. Attachments are reserved for material balance and engineering judgment calculation methods, unless there's additional information that needs to be provided for other calculation methods, and is difficult to include in the comments boxes. Please do not use attachments to avoid entering emissions factors and other values into CARES. All pollutants must be recorded no matter how insignificant. Common missing criteria air pollutants that we see are ammonia and lead. Please check your permit narrative for expected pollutants, and ensure that they are all included in CARES. You can also check WebFire for expected pollutants. If the specific process does not actually emit the expected pollutant, enter 0 and provide an explanation. Use engineering judgment for the calculation method. This is the only exception to marking 0 emissions and throughput as temporarily shut down or permanently shut down, as mentioned in the previous slides. For particulate matter reporting, if an emissions unit emits particulate matter, the facility must report 2 of the 3 components of PM10 and PM2.5. Georgia considers the 3 components as 1, PM condensable, 2, PM10 filterable and PM2.5 filterable, and 3, PM10 primary and PM2.5 primary. By reporting 2 of these components, EPA will be able to calculate the 3rd component, thus limiting PM augmentation. This gives facilities controls over their own data. However, if you do not have a reliable source to calculate all PM components, leave those blanks, and the EPA will use their PM augmentation tool to estimate the missing components. To identify different processes of each emissions unit's source classification codes are used. There can only be one SEC for each process unless you're making use of the alternative throughput option, which will allow you to duplicate the process but use a different throughput. Multiple processes of the same unit using the same SEC will result in a warning and CARES. In this example, the same SEC for both combustion and the dryer process is used. Instead, the user needs to use an in-process fuel for a flash dryer instead of the flash dryer process. Different fuels should have a different in-process fuel SECs. To access the full SEC list, you can use the website user interface or link to download all the SECs into a CSV file. This slide elaborates on operating hours. If using the bulk upload template, the average days per week, hours per day, and weeks per reporting period must equal hours per reporting period. Otherwise, the reporting system will change the hours entered in the template to the product of the 3 operating values. Note that the average days per week and average hours per day can be a decimal with up to 3 decimal places. Average weeks per reporting period and hours per reporting period can only be integers. And in the CARES user interface, the hours per reporting period is automatically calculated and will be rounded to an integer. In the next 2 slides, I will review what documentation will be needed for various calculation methods. For stack testing, there are 2 options, one without controls and the other that includes the control efficiency in the emissions factor. Please provide the test date, emissions factor ratio, if that applies, and where you got that ratio, if applicable, provide any control information. Note that there is a 100-character maximum, so there is another comment box below for any overflow. Material balance, we are looking for more documentation with the emissions reported. For PM emissions, we will want the density or specific gravity, solids content, and amount of material used. For VOC emissions, the data requirements are similar. Please provide this information in the description of calculations, or if it's more extensive, attach the documents and report summary attachment section. When using other emissions factors, please make sure to include all emission factor references. One possible application of the other emissions factor calculation method is when you're using AP42 emissions factor. It is no longer an official EPA emissions factor in CARES, but it's still the best option for your process. Include the reference in the emissions factor description. It's best practice not to check the prefer to calculate the total emissions of this pollutant, since that tends to lead to more mistakes or omitted calculation information. Finally, with engineering judgment, an emissions factor is not necessary, but can be useful if there is one. Provide the general methodology in the comments box and attach engineering judgment calculations in the report summary. So as a summary of the last few slides, facility information must match current permits, and shutdown units must be clearly marked as temporary or permanently shut down with the status of the year when updated. Unique SECs must accurately reflect each process under one unit. Preferably, SECs have expected pollutants and related emissions factors. Reported operating hours and throughput must match calculated values and reflect actual facility activity. Emission changes greater than 20% for CAPs or 10% for HAPs must include a clear explanation at process or facility level. And all pollutants required by permits or indicated in permit applications or reported before must be reported, and emission cannot be reproduced with valid emissions factors and throughput or provided documents. At least 2 of the 3 PM components must be reported correctly for PM10 and PM 2.5. Otherwise, the EPA will use augmentation to set the PM value. Control devices and release point control paths must be fully linked and consistent with facility permits. Each emission entry must include a documented calculation method with required references or attachments. HAP emissions must be included in CAP totals, must not exceed them, and must align with TRI data without double counting. And all CARE structural elements, including units, processes, pollutants, release points, and controls, must be fully entered and connected to avoid system errors. Now I'm going to pass it over to Alma for some helpful tips.
Thanks, Tess. Next, we're going to go into helpful tips for 2025 EI submission. So first, when you open the report for the new EI year, you'll see the report creation log. This will provide any updates from the EPA or provide any updates that CARE is giving you when uploading the bulk upload template. Next slide. Next, we'll go over tips on entering new emissions units. So when you enter new emissions, make sure that the control device ID and the emissions unit match the identification in the permit. If the permit and CARES do not match, it's important that you don't modify the IDs that you see in CARES, but instead just provide a comment or provide the correct ID in the description. When entering new emissions data, there's a certain order that is helpful to follow when entering that data. Start with the emissions unit, then go onto the process, then pollutant, then release point, then control device, then path. This is a map that helps provide an order of how you should enter the new emissions data. To connect the release point to the process, previous slide, please. To connect the release point to the process, go to the process level and then look for the release points associated to this process. This will associate the control paths to the process. Next slide. Okay, so if you ever get a control errors warning, you can access the process through the emissions inventory menu on the left side of the web page. Then on the process level page, you can find the release points associated section and select the edit button and add the control path to the process. If you have uploaded your data with us previously and no units in process has changed, you can set up bulk data entry and to update all your throughputs and keep everything else the same. Next, we'll get into resources and next steps you guys can take for the CARES EI submittal. We have our training and PowerPoint recording on our website, and then there are several EPA resources listed on the slide. Next. Then the EPA will also be providing CARES training sometime in the next year in January. And if you can't make those recordings, they will also be posting the recordings on their website as well. We will also be holding virtual help sessions every Tuesday and Thursday on 10:30 Eastern Standard Time from March to June. There'll be no help sessions after June 15th, so it's important to get a head start on your data submittals so we're able to address any problems as they come. Then after you guys submit your data, we'll do our QA checks and reach out on any errors or data verifications. Thank you for participating in this training seminar, and we hope that we continue this relationship between you guys and our missions inventory submittal. If you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand, or you can send any questions you have in the chat and we'll get them answered. And if you think of any questions later, please contact us at this email. Thank you.